The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, echoing through their suburban kitchen as she stood frozen with a college brochure in her trembling hands. "You're too old to change careers," her husband David repeated, his voice dripping with dismissive certainty as he sipped his morning coffee without even looking up from his newspaper. 52 years old? And you want to go back to school? Be realistic, Margaret. You've been a secretary for 30 years. That's what you are. The cruel finality in his tone made her chest tighten with a familiar ache of diminished dreams and suffocated potential that had been building inside her for years. "Hi everyone, I'm Tina, and I'm here with you today as your friend and confidant, ready to share another story that will touch your heart and remind you that it's never too late to transform your life completely. Today, I'm bringing you the incredible journey of Margaret, a woman who proved that age is just a number when determination meets opportunity. This story will show you exactly how someone dismissed as too old became the absolute best in a field that rejected her based on assumptions and prejudice. Stay with me until the very end, because you're going to witness one of the most satisfying transformations I've ever shared. And trust me, the ending will leave you feeling inspired and empowered. If this story resonates with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to join our community of incredible souls who believe in second chances and unlimited potential. Margaret Sarah Chen had spent 3 decades of her life in the same beige cubicle, typing letters, scheduling appointments, and organizing files for a law firm where she was treated more like office furniture than a human being with dreams and aspirations. Every morning, she would wake up in their modest 2-bedroom house in Springfield, prepare breakfast for David, pack his lunch with the same mechanical precision she'd perfected over their 28 years of marriage, and then drive to work wondering if this was really all life had to offer her. The routine had become her prison, but somewhere deep inside, a spark of something greater had been quietly burning, waiting for the right moment to ignite into something extraordinary. For months, Margaret had been secretly researching interior design programs at the local community college, carefully bookmarking websites and printing out course catalogs when David wasn't around to mock her interests. She had always possessed an incredible eye for color, space, and aesthetics, transforming their own home into a warm, inviting sanctuary that friends constantly complimented and neighbors admired from the street. Her sister Linda had been encouraging her for years to pursue her natural talent, pointing out how Margaret could walk into any room and immediately envision how to make it more beautiful, more functional, more alive. "You have a gift," Linda would say during their weekend coffee meetings. "Don't let it waste away in that awful office." But every time Margaret had tentatively mentioned her interest to David, he would shut down the conversation with practical concerns about money, time, and what he considered her unrealistic expectations about starting over at her age. The morning David delivered his crushing verdict about her being too old, Margaret had finally gathered enough courage to show him the interior design program brochure, complete with her carefully calculated budget for tuition and a timeline showing how she could complete the program while still working part-time. She had spent weeks crafting her presentation, anticipating his objections, and preparing thoughtful responses to each concern. Instead, she was met with mockery and condescension that cut deeper than any physical wound. "Interior design?" he had scoffed, finally looking up from his sports section with a smirk that made her feel about 2 inches tall. "Margaret, you watch too. Much HGTV. That's not a real career for someone like you. Those designer people are young, trendy, artistic types. You're a secretary from Springfield. Know your place." That afternoon at work, Margaret sat in her familiar cubicle staring at her computer screen through tears she refused to let fall. Her heart breaking, not just from David's cruel words, but from the realization that she had allowed someone else's limited vision to define her potential for far too long. Her colleague Jennifer, noticing her unusual quietness, gently asked if everything was okay. For the first time in years, Margaret found herself speaking honestly about her dreams, her passion for design, and the crushing weight of feeling trapped in a life that no longer fit who she was becoming. Jennifer listened with growing amazement, revealing that she had always noticed Margaret's incredible style and natural ability to make any space feel special. Margaret, Jennifer said with conviction that surprised them. Both. My sister owns a small design firm downtown, and she's always looking for fresh talent. Age doesn't matter in creativity. Would you like me to arrange a meeting? The offer felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person, and Margaret found herself nodding yes before her familiar doubts could talk her out of it. That evening, instead of preparing David's usual elaborate dinner, Margaret made a simple sandwich and placed it on the kitchen counter with a note that read, "Gone to explore my future. There's leftover casserole in the fridge." For the first time in decades, she drove to the community college campus not as a secret reconnaissance mission, but as a prospective student ready to enroll in the program that would change her life forever. Walking through those hallways filled with students of all ages pursuing their dreams, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope mixed with determination and an unshakable belief that her best years weren't behind her, but stretching endlessly ahead into a future she was finally ready to create for herself. The enrollment office buzzed with activity as Margaret filled out her application with hands that shook slightly from excitement rather than fear, each signature feeling like a small act of revolution against the voice in her head that sounded suspiciously like David's dismissive tone. The admissions counselor, a kind woman named Patricia who appeared to be around Margaret's age, reviewed her paperwork with genuine enthusiasm and shared that some of their most successful graduates had been career changers who brought life experience and determination that younger students sometimes lacked. Maturity is an asset in this field, Patricia explained warmly, her eyes crinkling with understanding. Clients trust designers who understand how real people live, who have managed households and understand practical needs alongside aesthetic beauty. Your background isn't a disadvantage, Margaret. It's exactly what will set you apart from the competition. Patricia leaned forward conspiratorially, lowering her voice. Between you and me, some of our youngest graduates struggle because they've never had to make a tight budget work or understand what it's like when children spill grape juice on white furniture. You bring wisdom they simply can't learn from textbooks. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as Patricia continued, I can see the passion in your eyes, the hunger to create something beautiful and meaningful. That fire doesn't diminish with age. It often burns brighter because you finally understand what truly matters in life. The first day of classes arrived with September's crisp promise of new beginnings, and Margaret walked into the studio classroom feeling like she was stepping into a completely different version of herself. Her classmates ranged in age from 19 to 68, each bringing their own unique perspective and story of why they had chosen to pursue interior design. There was James, a retired military officer looking for a creative outlet after decades of structured service. Sarah, a young mother who wanted to build a career around her children's schedule. And Robert, a former accountant who had discovered his passion for space planning during his own home renovation. The diversity of backgrounds created an incredibly rich learning environment where everyone's experience contributed to the collective knowledge of the group. Professor Williams, a seasoned designer with over 20 years in the industry, immediately recognized Margaret's natural instincts and frequently used her work as examples of how to balance functionality with beauty. This is exactly what I'm talking about, she would say, holding up Margaret's mood boards and space plans. Notice how Margaret considers not just how a room looks, but how it feels to live in. She understands that great design serves the people who inhabit the space. The validation felt like sunshine. After years of clouds, and Margaret found herself blooming in ways she had forgotten were possible. Her confidence grew with each project, each positive critique, each moment when she solved a design challenge that had stumped her younger classmates. Meanwhile, at home, David's attitude shifted from dismissive mockery to cold resentment as he watched Margaret transform before his eyes. She would come home from classes energized and talkative, eager to share what she had learned about color, theory, spatial relationships, and the psychology of design. Instead of engaging with her excitement, he would make pointed comments about dinner being late, the house being neglected, and money being wasted on frivolous pursuits. You're becoming someone I don't recognize, he told her one evening. And Margaret realized with startling clarity that he was absolutely right, and she had never been happier about anything in her entire life. The woman she was becoming was confident, creative, and completely unwilling to shrink herself to fit into David's narrow definition of who she should be. The breakthrough moment came during her portfolio review at the end of her first semester, when Professor Williams pulled her aside after class and spoke words that would echo in Margaret's heart for the rest of her life. "Margaret, I've been teaching for 15 years, and I rarely see natural talent combined with such strong work ethic and mature perspective. Have you considered that this isn't just a hobby or career change, but possibly your true calling that you finally found courage to pursue?" The conversation continued as they walked to the parking lot, with Professor Williams explaining that her design firm often took on interns and that Margaret's work was already at a professional level that impressed everyone in the department. "I'd like to offer you an internship position for next semester," she said. "It's paid, flexible around your class schedule, and I think you'll find it gives you exactly the real-world experience you need to launch successfully after graduation." As Margaret drove home that evening, she found herself laughing with pure joy at the absurdity of how wrong David had been about her potential, how wrong she had been about her own limitations, and how magnificently life could surprise you when you finally had courage to reach for what you truly wanted. She had spent so many years defining herself by other people's expectations and limitations that she had almost forgotten the fierce, creative, capable woman who had been waiting patiently inside for permission to emerge. Now, at 52, she wasn't too old to change careers. She was exactly the right age to become everything she was meant to be. Friends, if this story is touching your heart, I want you to know that you're part of a special community here. We're not just watching stories, we're reminding each other that transformation is possible at any age, in any circumstance. Please, subscribe and hit that notification bell because I have so many more incredible journeys to share with you. And in the comments, I'd love to hear about a dream you've been putting off or a moment when someone underestimated your potential. Your story matters, and sharing it might inspire someone else to take that first brave step toward their own transformation. The internship at Williams Design Studio opened Margaret's eyes to a world she had only dreamed about, where creativity merged seamlessly with business acumen, and every day brought new challenges that excited rather than exhausted her. She quickly proved herself invaluable to the team, bringing organizational skills honed through decades of administrative work, combined with fresh design insights that impressed even the most experienced staff members. Within weeks, Professor Williams began assigning her increasingly complex projects, recognizing that Margaret possessed not just artistic talent, but the practical wisdom to understand client needs and budget constraints that often eluded younger designers who were long on creativity but short on real-world experience. Her first major client presentation came sooner than expected when the studio's lead designer fell ill with pneumonia just days before a crucial meeting with potential new clients, the Henderson family, who were renovating their recently purchased Victorian home in the historic district. Professor Williams made the bold decision to have Margaret step in as the primary presenter, armed with her meticulously prepared design concepts and natural ability to connect with people on an emotional level. "I believe in you," Professor Williams told her the night before the meeting. "You understand what this family needs because you understand how families actually live. Trust your instincts and let your passion show through." Margaret spent that entire evening rehearsing her presentation, not from nerves, but from excitement about finally having the opportunity to share her vision with clients who would benefit from her unique perspective. The meeting exceeded everyone's expectations as Margaret walked the Henderson family through her comprehensive design plan that honored the home's historic character while creating functional spaces for modern family life. Her presentation included detailed mood boards, fabric samples, furniture layouts, and a timeline that demonstrated her thorough understanding of both the creative and logistical aspects of interior design. Mrs. Henderson was particularly impressed with Margaret's suggestions for the master bedroom, which balanced her desire for elegance with Mr. Henderson's need for practical storage solutions. Finally, a designer who understands that we actually have to live in these spaces, Mrs. Henderson said, with obvious relief. "Everything looks beautiful in magazines, but you're showing us how to make our home both gorgeous and livable." The Hendersons signed the contract that same afternoon, marking Margaret's first official project as a professional interior designer. The success of the Henderson project opened floodgates of referrals as word spread through Springfield's close-knit community about the talented new designer who combined artistic vision with practical sensibility. Margaret found herself working evenings and weekends, not from obligation, but from pure love of what she was doing, transforming spaces for young families, empty nesters, and everyone between who appreciated her unique ability to create beauty that enhanced rather than complicated their daily lives. Each project built her confidence and reputation while reinforcing her belief that she had finally found her true purpose in life. The financial rewards followed naturally as clients eagerly paid for results that exceeded their expectations and created homes they genuinely loved living in. At home, however, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense as David watched his wife's transformation with growing resentment and what Margaret finally recognized as fear that she was outgrowing him and the small life they had built together. His criticism became more pointed and personal, questioning her priorities, her dedication to their marriage, and her sudden obsession with work that he still refused to acknowledge as a legitimate career. "You're neglecting your responsibilities here," he would complain when she worked late on client presentations or spent weekend mornings shopping for furniture and accessories. "I married a wife, not some wannabe decorator who's never home anymore." Margaret tried initially to maintain peace by explaining her projects and sharing her excitement. But David's consistent negativity eventually wore down her desire to include him in this new chapter of her life. The pivotal moment came during Margaret's 6-month evaluation at the studio, when Professor Williams made an offer that would change everything: the opportunity to become a junior partner in the firm with equity ownership and the chance to develop her own client base under the studio's established brand. "Margaret, you've exceeded every expectation we had," Professor Williams explained during their private meeting. "Your clients specifically request you for future projects, your design sensibility is maturing beautifully, and your business instincts are exceptional. We'd like you to transition from intern to partner, which means significantly increased income, creative control over your projects, and a real stake in the company's future success." The offer included a substantial salary increase that would actually exceed David's income from his insurance sales job, along with benefits and profit sharing that made this opportunity impossible to ignore. That evening, Margaret prepared David's favorite meal and waited until they were both settled in the living room before sharing the incredible news about her partnership offer and what it would mean for their financial security and her career trajectory. Instead of celebration, David's response revealed the depth of his insecurity and inability to support her success. "So now you think you're better than me?" he snapped, his face flushed with anger and wounded pride. "You make more money, and suddenly I'm not good enough for the great interior designer Margaret Chen? This whole thing has gone too far, Margaret. It's time to stop playing pretend and remember who you really are." His words stung, not because they were true, but because they showed her exactly who he really was. Someone who needed her to remain small so he could feel big. Someone who viewed her success as his failure rather than their shared victory. Margaret stared at David across their living room, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in their long marriage, recognizing that the man she had spent nearly 3 decades trying to please was fundamentally incapable of celebrating her achievements or supporting her dreams. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that had been widening for months, filled with unspoken resentments and incompatible visions of what their life together should look like. "I am remembering who I really am," Margaret said quietly, her voice steady despite the earthquake of emotions rumbling inside her chest. "For the first time in years, I know exactly who I am, and I'm not going to apologize for it anymore." David's face twisted with anger and something that looked suspiciously like panic as he realized that his usual tactics of dismissal and emotional manipulation were no longer working on the confident woman sitting across from him. The partnership papers sat on Margaret's desk at the studio for 3 days while she wrestled with the implications of accepting an opportunity that would fundamentally change not just her career trajectory, but the entire structure of her life. Professor Williams, sensing Margaret's internal struggle, invited her for coffee. At a quiet cafe near the campus, where they could speak openly about the challenges of balancing personal relationships with professional growth. "I've seen this pattern before," Professor Williams said gently, stirring sugar into her latte while choosing her words carefully. "Talented women who discover their potential later in life often face resistance from partners who preferred the previous version of the relationship. The question you have to ask yourself is whether you're willing to limit your future to preserve a past that may no longer serve you." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Professor Williams sharing stories of other students who had faced similar crossroads and the different paths they had chosen based on their priorities and values. That weekend, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself by accepting an invitation to attend a design industry networking event in Chicago, her first professional conference where she would meet designers, suppliers, and potential clients from across the Midwest. David's reaction to her travel plans confirmed everything she had been reluctantly acknowledging about the state of their marriage. "You're choosing your little hobby over our anniversary weekend," he accused, despite the fact that their anniversary was still 2 months away. "This is exactly what I'm talking about, Margaret. You've become selfish and obsessed with impressing strangers instead of taking care of your family." Margaret packed her suitcase while listening to his complaints, feeling surprisingly calm about her decision to prioritize her professional development over his manipulative attempts to keep her tethered to a life that no longer fit who she was becoming. The Chicago conference exceeded Margaret's wildest expectations as she found herself surrounded by creative professionals who shared her passion for transforming spaces and understood the unique satisfaction that came from helping clients create homes they truly loved. She attended workshops on sustainable design, color psychology, and small business management while networking with designers who had built successful practices around serving clients similar to those in Springfield. The highlight came when she was introduced to Maria Rodriguez, a designer from Milwaukee who had started her own firm at age 48 and now employed 12 people while specializing in historic home renovations. "Age gives us credibility that young designers have to earn," Maria explained during lunch. "Clients trust us because we understand how real families live, what works practically, and how to create beauty that enhances daily life rather than complicating it. Your maturity isn't a disadvantage, Margaret. It's your secret weapon." The return trip to Springfield gave Margaret 4 hours of highway solitude to process everything she had experienced and make some crucial decisions about her future direction. The conference had opened her eyes to possibilities she hadn't even considered, including the potential to eventually open her own design firm specializing in services for Springfield's growing population of professional families and empty nesters who wanted sophisticated design without pretentious complications. Her phone buzzed constantly with texts from David demanding to know when she would be home and complaining about having to fend for himself for 2 days. Messages that felt increasingly pathetic rather than guilt-inducing. As Margaret contemplated the exciting possibilities stretching ahead of her, Monday morning brought a conversation with Professor Williams that would set everything in motion as Margaret officially accepted the junior partnership and began discussing her vision for expanding the studio's services to include specialized consulting for clients who wanted to age in place gracefully or create multi-generational family homes. "I want to focus on real people with real budgets who need spaces that work as beautifully as they look," Margaret explained, her confidence evident in every word. "There's a huge market in Springfield for sophisticated design that doesn't require magazine budgets or impractical furniture. I want to prove that everyone deserves to live in a space that reflects who they are and supports how they actually live." Professor Williams smiled knowingly, recognizing that Margaret had not only found her professional calling, but was ready to make her own unique mark on the interior design industry. That evening, Margaret came home to find David waiting in the kitchen with what appeared to be a prepared speech about compromise and getting their marriage back on track. But his words felt hollow and desperate rather than sincere, as he promised to be more supportive if she would just scale back her ambitions to something more manageable and wife-appropriate. Margaret listened patiently before responding with clarity that surprised them both. "David, I love you, but I won't make myself smaller to make you feel bigger anymore. This is who I am, and this is what I'm meant to do. You can choose to support me and grow with me, or you can choose to resent me and fight against my success. But I won't choose to limit myself to preserve a version of our relationship that only worked when I didn't know my own worth." The conversation that night marked a turning point that neither Margaret nor David could ignore, as she laid out her vision for the future with the kind of clarity and determination that comes from finally knowing your own mind completely. She explained her partnership responsibilities, her growing client base, and her long-term plans to eventually establish her own firm specializing in accessible luxury design for Springfield's emerging market of discerning but practical homeowners. David listened with increasing agitation, his discomfort obvious as Margaret spoke about financial projections, marketing strategies, and networking opportunities. With the confidence of someone who had found their true calling and intended to pursue it without apology or compromise. "You're talking like some kind of business executive," he said, his tone revealing how threatened he felt by her transformation from compliant housewife to empowered professional entrepreneur. Margaret's client list grew exponentially through the spring and summer months as word spread about the talented designer who could create magazine-worthy spaces on realistic budgets, while understanding the practical needs of families who actually lived in their homes rather than simply displaying them. Her signature style emerged as sophisticated comfort, combining classic design principles with contemporary functionality and always prioritizing the emotional connection between families and their living spaces. The Richardson family hired her to transform their dated ranch home into a warm, inviting space perfect for entertaining their large extended family. The Johnsons entrusted her with their Victorian restoration, appreciating her ability to honor historical details while incorporating modern conveniences seamlessly. Each successful project generated multiple referrals as clients eagerly shared their experiences with friends and neighbors who could see the dramatic improvements Margaret had achieved. The financial transformation was equally dramatic, as Margaret's income from the partnership quickly surpassed David's insurance commissions, allowing her to contribute significantly more to their household expenses while also building substantial savings for future business investments. She opened her own business checking account, established credit lines for purchasing furniture and materials, and began developing relationships with suppliers who recognized her growing influence in Springfield's design community. The independence felt intoxicating after decades of financial dependence, and Margaret found herself making decisions about major purchases and investments without seeking David's approval or worrying about his criticism of her spending choices. This financial autonomy represented far more than money. It symbolized her complete evolution from dependent wife to self-sufficient professional woman capable of creating her own security and success. David's response to Margaret's increasing success and independence became increasingly erratic and controlling as he recognized that traditional methods of maintaining dominance in their relationship were no longer effective. He began questioning her work schedule, demanding detailed accounts of her client meetings, and making disparaging comments about her appearance when she dressed professionally for important presentations. "You're trying to look like someone you're not," he would say when she wore the sophisticated blazers and stylish accessories appropriate for her new role as design professional. "You used to dress like a normal wife, not some fancy career woman who thinks she's too good for her husband." Margaret initially tried to reassure him that her professional development didn't diminish her commitment to their marriage, but gradually realized that his insecurity ran too deep for rational discussion or compromise. The crisis came when David deliberately sabotaged Margaret's most important presentation by calling her phone repeatedly during her meeting with the Williamson family, who were considering a complete home renovation that would be her largest project to date. The constant interruptions were embarrassing and unprofessional, forcing Margaret to apologize repeatedly while trying to maintain focus on her design presentation. Mrs. Williamson noticed Margaret's obvious distress and asked privately if everything was okay, creating an awkward moment that could have cost Margaret the contract. That evening, David claimed he had been worried about her being late and just wanted to check on her safety, but Margaret recognized the manipulation and deliberate sabotage for what it was. An attempt to undermine her professional credibility because her success threatened his sense of superiority and control. That night, Margaret made the most difficult decision of her adult life by telling David that their marriage could not continue unless he committed to supporting her career and treating her as an equal partner rather than a subordinate whose dreams were optional and whose success was threatening. "I've spent 30 years making myself smaller so you could feel bigger," she said, with tears streaming down her face, but her voice strong and unwavering. "I won't do it anymore, David. I finally know who I am and what I'm capable of, and I refuse to pretend otherwise to protect your ego. Either you learn to celebrate my success instead of sabotaging it, or we need to seriously discuss whether this marriage has a future." The ultimatum hung in the air between them like a bridge that David could either cross to join her in this new chapter or refuse to acknowledge while watching her walk away from everything they had built together. My dear friends, I hope Margaret's courage is inspiring you as much as it's inspiring me. Sometimes the people closest to us have the hardest time accepting our growth and transformation. If you're going through something similar, please know that you're not alone. Subscribe to stay connected with our community and share in the comments about a time when you had to choose between playing small or stepping into your power. Your story could be exactly what someone else needs to hear today to find their own courage. David's response to Margaret's ultimatum revealed the depth of his inability to evolve alongside her transformation, as he doubled down on his resentment and began actively working to undermine her confidence and professional relationships. He started making unannounced visits to her workplace under the guise of bringing lunch or checking on her schedule, creating uncomfortable situations that made her colleagues question the stability of her personal life and its potential impact on her professional reliability. Professor Williams eventually had to address the situation directly, explaining to Margaret that, while the studio supported her completely, David's disruptive behavior was creating tension that needed resolution before it affected other clients and staff members. "This isn't about your marriage," Professor Williams said gently but firmly. "This is about protecting the professional environment we've all worked hard to create. Something has to change, Margaret, and soon." The breaking point came during the Henderson family's housewarming party, where Margaret's design work was being celebrated by 50 guests who couldn't stop complimenting the stunning transformation she had achieved throughout their Victorian home. Margaret moved through the crowded rooms, graciously accepting praise and answering questions about her design choices while networking with potential new clients who had heard about her growing reputation. David arrived unexpectedly, despite not being invited to what was clearly a professional event, and immediately began making inappropriate comments about the costs of the renovation and questioning whether the Hendersons had really needed such expensive improvements. His behavior was embarrassing and unprofessional, leading Mrs. Henderson to quietly ask Margaret if they should call security to remove her disruptive husband from their private celebration. The drive home after the party was conducted in complete silence as Margaret processed the full extent of David's sabotage and what it meant for both her marriage and her career trajectory. She realized that continuing to accommodate his insecurity and controlling behavior would eventually destroy everything she had worked so hard to build, not just professionally, but personally in terms of her self-respect and hard-won confidence. The woman who had discovered her calling at 52 was not the same person who had tolerated years of dismissive treatment and emotional manipulation, and she could no longer pretend that love alone was sufficient to bridge the gap between who she had become and who David needed her to remain. The choice was stark and unavoidable. Sacrifice her authentic self to preserve a relationship built on inequality, or honor her growth and accept the consequences of refusing to shrink back into a role that no longer fit. Margaret spent the weekend alone while David visited his brother in Chicago, using the solitude to make lists of her priorities, her non-negotiables, and her vision for the next phase of her life, with or without him as a supportive partner. She walked through their house, seeing it with designer's eyes, recognizing how the space reflected her old life of compromise and accommodation, rather than the confident professional woman she had become. Every room told the story of someone who had made decisions based on other people's preferences and budgets, someone who had never claimed space for her own dreams or insisted on design choices that reflected her personal style and aesthetic vision. The house felt like a museum of her former self, beautiful in its way, but no longer suitable for the person she was becoming. Monday morning brought a conversation with her divorce attorney, Linda Reeves, whom Margaret's sister had recommended as someone who specialized in helping women navigate financial transitions during midlife divorces. Linda listened carefully to Margaret's situation, taking notes about her business partnership, growing income, and professional prospects, while explaining how Illinois law would likely divide their marital assets and what Margaret could expect in terms of spousal support obligations or entitlements. "Your timing is actually quite favorable," Linda explained. "You've established clear evidence of your earning potential and professional independence, which strengthens your position considerably. The fact that you're supporting yourself through your own business rather than traditional employment also provides some protection for your future income growth." The meeting gave Margaret the practical information she needed to make informed decisions about her marriage based on financial reality rather than emotional attachment to past investments. That evening, Margaret prepared what would be their final serious conversation about the future of their relationship, setting out her conditions for reconciliation with the clarity and directness she had learned through months of successful client presentations and business negotiations. "David, I love the man I married 28 years ago, but that man needs to evolve into someone who can celebrate his wife's success instead of sabotaging it," she began, her voice calm but unwavering. "I'm offering you one last opportunity to join me in building a partnership based on mutual respect and shared celebration of each other's achievements. If you can't do that, if my success will always threaten you and my happiness will always diminish yours, then we need to end this marriage while we still have enough respect for each other to do it with dignity and fairness." She handed him Linda's business card and explained that she had already begun the legal process of protecting her business interests and establishing her financial independence, not as a threat, but as evidence of her commitment to moving forward with or without his participation. David's reaction confirmed everything Margaret had reluctantly concluded about their fundamental incompatibility and his inability to change in the ways necessary for their relationship to survive her transformation. He accused her of betraying their wedding vows, abandoning her duties as a wife, and choosing strangers over family in pursuit of selfish ambitions that would ultimately leave her lonely and unsuccessful. His words revealed not just his fear of losing control, but his complete misunderstanding of what she had accomplished and what motivated her pursuit of professional fulfillment. Margaret listened to his familiar litany of complaints and criticisms with surprising detachment, recognizing that she was hearing the desperate protests of someone who preferred the comfortable dynamics of inequality to the uncertain challenges of growth and adaptation. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the spacious downtown office of her newly established firm, Chen Design Solutions, surrounded by fabric samples, architectural plans, and the organized chaos of a thriving interior design business that had exceeded her wildest expectations for success and professional satisfaction. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated her custom-built drafting table where blueprints for 3 major residential projects lay spread in careful order, each representing families who had entrusted her with transforming their most intimate spaces into reflections of their dreams and personalities. The divorce had been finalized with surprising efficiency once David realized that Margaret's determination was absolute and her legal preparation thorough, leaving her with sufficient assets to launch her independent practice while maintaining the comfortable lifestyle she had grown accustomed to through her partnership earnings. Her client base had followed her. seamlessly from Professor Williams' studio, along with several new referrals who specifically sought out the designer everyone in Springfield was talking about as the woman who had transformed her own life as dramatically as she transformed their living spaces. The walls of her office displayed before and after photographs of her completed projects, testimonial letters from grateful clients, and her recently earned certification from the National Council for Interior Design Qualification, evidence of the professional credibility she had worked so tirelessly to establish in an industry that initially questioned her credentials and experience. The phone rang constantly with requests for consultations, project proposals, and speaking engagements at community organizations where Margaret shared her story of career transformation and entrepreneurial success with audiences of women who saw themselves in her journey from secretary to sought-after design professional. Her signature style had evolved into what local magazines called accessible elegance, combining sophisticated design principles with practical functionality and budgets that reflected real family priorities rather than magazine fantasies. The waiting list for her services extended 4 months into the future, a testament to both her design skills and her reputation for treating every client with the respect and attention she had always wished to receive from service professionals in her own life. Each completed project carried her personal touch of understanding how spaces could nurture emotional healing and renewed confidence. Insights born from her own journey of rebuilding her identity after years of diminished expectations and suppressed dreams had nearly convinced her that mediocrity was her destined fate. The knock on her office door interrupted Margaret's review of fabric samples for the Morrison family's living room renovation, and she looked up to see a familiar figure standing uncertainly in her doorway with an expression that mixed embarrassment with desperate hope. David appeared older and somehow smaller than she remembered, his confident swagger replaced by the hesitant posture of someone who had lost the foundation of his self-importance and was struggling to find new footing in circumstances he couldn't control or manipulate. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame, suggesting weight loss from stress, and the deep lines around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights spent contemplating the magnitude of his miscalculations regarding both Margaret's potential and the consequences of his dismissive treatment of her ambitions. "Margaret," he said quietly, his voice lacking the commanding tone she had endured for so many years, replaced instead by the tentative inflection of someone requesting rather than demanding attention. "Could we talk? Could you spare a few minutes to hear what I have to say?" The request was polite rather than demanding, suggesting that the intervening months had taught him something about the consequences of taking her for granted and dismissing her capabilities. Margaret gestured to the chair across from her desk, curious about what had brought her former husband to her office, but no longer emotionally invested in his approval or disapproval of her choices and achievements. David looked around the professional space with obvious surprise, taking in the awards on her walls, the sophisticated design samples, and the general atmosphere of success and competence that surrounded her new life. "I made a mistake," he said finally, his words coming slowly, as if each one cost him considerable effort. "I didn't understand what you were trying to do, and I let my own fears make me say things and do things that I regret more than I can tell you. I've been watching your success from a distance, seeing the articles in the newspaper about your business, hearing people around town talk about the amazing designer who transformed their homes. I realize now that I was wrong about everything, Margaret. You weren't too old to change careers. You were exactly the right age to become everything you were meant to be." The apology continued for several minutes, as David acknowledged the specific ways he had undermined her confidence, sabotaged her professional relationships, and failed to support her dreams during the crucial early stages of her transformation. He spoke about attending counseling sessions to understand his own insecurities and learning to recognize how his need for control had damaged not just their marriage, but his ability to form healthy relationships with anyone who threatened his sense of superiority. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, and I'm not asking you to take me back," he said, his voice thick with emotion that seemed genuine rather than manipulative. "I just needed you to know that I was completely wrong, and I'm genuinely proud of what you've accomplished. You've become someone extraordinary, Margaret, And I'm sorry I wasn't smart enough or secure enough to support you when you needed it most. Margaret listened to David's confession with compassion, but without the emotional turmoil she might have expected from such a conversation, recognizing that his acknowledgement of her success felt satisfying but no longer necessary for her sense of validation or self-worth. "Thank you for saying that," she replied calmly. "I appreciate your honesty, and I